1.7, it says Unit 1 Summary. If you guys aren't there, go ahead and get there. 1.7, we're going to review Unit 1 this week. There are a good amount of review exercises, which I'm impressed that they've taken the time to go through and create all the examples that they have and different questions. They're good resources. Okay, and at the top of 1.7, it says in this unit, you learned about the 3 primitive data types on the exam: int, double, and boolean. Okay, those are the 3 primitive data types. What's the other data type that we talked about? Strings. All right, strings are characters assembled together, and characters and symbols that can be used together. You have also learned how to declare and change the values of variables. You know, we've talked about how to declare variables and then also initialize them. We learned about different operators, the arithmetic operators. You might see it also called mathematical operators: plus, minus, multiplication, division. We use the modulus. Casting, how to turn a double into an int and an int into a double. And then also how to use constants and min and max integer values, right? We learned that since computers are finite and they're not finite, we have different storage for each different type of variable. Okay, each data type requires a certain amount of storage. So it goes through and it lists a bunch of vocabulary words, okay, that we've talked about. I'm not going to go through every single one here, but this is good to take a look at, right? These are all the vocab words that we've talked about: compiler or syntax error, the main method, variable, how to declare a variable, how to initialize a variable, different data types, integer, boolean. Usually I see boolean with a capital B because it was named after someone with the last name Boole. I'm not sure. That's one of the first times I've seen it lowercase like that. Camel case, how to cast a variable, operators, compound assignment, just they're really shortcuts. The modulo, also called the modulus, arithmetic expressions, and how they take precedence of order of operations as well. Okay, so operator precedence. Below it, it has the different keywords. And in Java, there are specific keywords that are used that you cannot use as variables because those keywords are instructions to the computer. So some keywords we talked about were boolean and double and int. Those were all the data types, as well as string. Okay, then we talked about the difference between system.out print versus system.out print line, print ln. Print ln actually adds a new line at the end once it's done printing. Okay, the assignment operator, which is just an equal sign, and then all the arithmetic operators. And it looks like they spelled arithmetic wrong. It says arithmetic. Okay, 1.7.3, it says vocabulary practice. Drag the definition from left and drop it on the correct concept on the right. The first definition that I have, it says specifying the type and name for a variable. And that is declaring a variable. So I'm going to drag and drop it on declaring a variable. All right. The next definition, a name associated with a memory location. Okay. So we've given a name to a certain variable and it will be stored in a memory location. So a name associated with a memory location, that is a variable. A whole number. Now it's funny because in Algebra 1, when I teach Algebra 1, I teach my students that whole numbers are integers, but integers are not whole numbers. I don't believe that's an accurate description because real numbers include all decimals, imaginary numbers. There's real numbers, there's imaginary numbers, and there's rational numbers and irrational numbers. Rational meaning that we can come to a conclusion of how this pattern ends in a number 3.78 or a pattern that's repeating. But an irrational number like pi, right, just continues to move on forever and there's no pattern. But when we talk about integers and whole numbers, to me, whole numbers start at 0 and start 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and up to an infinite number, right? Integers also include the negative versions of those numbers. So it says an integer is a whole number, but really a whole number is an integer. Interesting. An expression that is either true or false, that is a boolean value. All right, so once you've dragged all of them, you click check me. It says you are correct. All right, 172, the same exact thing. It says a type used to represent decimal values. Which one is that? A double. Okay, the data type we use to represent decimal values is a double. It's not an integer. All right, the next one, an operator that returns the remainder. It just says mod, right? That's going to be a modulo or modulus, an operator that returns the remainder. Changing the type of a variable is casting a variable. You might also see it written as converting a variable. And the last one, setting the value of a variable the first time. The first time you give it a value, you initialize the variable. Okay. If you are initializing a variable, it can change throughout. You give it an initial value, and that value can change. Okay. Looks like all these are right. And then it says for more practice, see this Quizlet embedded below, and it gives you a Quizlet of 24 different cards, and you can click through them. You can go through them if you really want to. You don't have to, but you can go through each of the, I guess they create a Quizlet for you there. All right, 174 says common mistakes. Okay, Java is case sensitive. That's one of the questions that's on the quiz for this week, which I'll get into later. But a common mistake is forgetting that Java is case sensitive, and you may have written a variable and wrote it in camel case as my score, and then later on the program referred to as my score all lowercase, and the computer not recognize your variable name. Another common mistake is forgetting to specify the type when declaring a variable, especially if you're coming from Python, because in Python, we could just declare a variable without a type. But in Java, we have to list the type. All right, we can't just list the variable name and then the value. We also have to give it a type. Using a variable name, but never declaring the variable. That's important to declare the variable in the beginning. Using the wrong name for the variable. Maybe you create a variable called student total, but then later on tried calling total, forgetting what your variable names are. Typically, when I'm writing a program, or a practice that I recommend, is by writing your variable names out, as well as eventually we'll learn about classes, we'll learn about different methods, and writing those out and organizing them and creating different objects, and then looking at the object and seeing what the methods are in the class, what the variable names are, and being organized in your approach. We'll talk more about that later, another week, not right now. Using the wrong type for a variable, that's important because you may actually cast a value that's not the correct value or not the anticipated value that you wanted. It says, don't forget that using integer types will give you an integer. So if you're dividing 2 divided by 3 and you're looking for the right answer, you get 0 if you don't cast as a double, because 2 divided by 3 is 0 point something. And when you're dealing with integers, they just drop whatever the decimal is. So 2 divided by 3 would return 0 unless you're casting as a double. All right. Using the double equal to symbol is used to compare double values. Okay. So by doing that, it says, remember the double values are often approximation. Okay. You might want to test if the absolute value of the difference between the two values is less than some amount instead. We didn't do that often. I wouldn't get hung up over that, but that's a common mistake, is using the double equal sign to compare double values. All right. And the last one, assuming that some value like 0 will be smaller than other int values. Remember that int values can be negative as well. Okay. And on my screen, it says you've attempted 3 of 3 activities on this page, completed, well done. If you click on you might say you've only done 2 out of 3, click on the Quizlet, and I think that will take away the third one for you. All right. And that is 1.7, the Unit 1 summary.